Alrighty everyone, it is time to combine thing I got famous for with thing that is new and shiny. Frontier monsters in Monster Hunter Wilds. I want to talk about the members of Monster Hunter's craziest entry that I think would work well in the maps and the environments that Wilds has to offer. And you know what? I wanted to put some actual thought into these entries as well. Put some legitimate effort into what I think would be a really fitting choice for the maps of Wilds. I don't just want to smash monsters that originated in Frontier's desert biome and then just crush them up into Wilds' desert biome because it's the same biome type. I figured I'd make things a little bit challenging for myself. I wanted to look at the maps as they are. The space, the size, the content of their zones, and the animals in them, what monster types are in there, what they do, what their abilities are, and then pick the frontier monsters that I think would be the most fitting for each hunting locale and would bring the most to that hunting locale and would operate the best within them. I also gave myself the challenge of picking 3 frontier monsters per map that I would fit, and then ordering them from the one I want the most on that map to the one that I want the least of that 3. Now, there may be a few straggler monsters that I still would want to include on the Wilds maps here and there, as well as some big bad bosses that I also kind of want to mention. So this is kind of sort of a list of 15, but you know, with caveats here and there because it's me and I can't help myself. Needless to say, this video is going to contain full spoilers for Monster Hunter Wilds, so be warned. Alright, so we're going to kick things off with, of course, the first map, the Windward Plains. So the number 1 monster that I think would work on the Windward Plains is Quaru-Sepusu of Frontier, this massive crystal-covered shark-like leviathan. Yeah, we already do have a leviathan who operates out here, but Quaru operates super differently from Balahara. He's also a bit of a lightning absorber like Raidao, but it operates in quite a different way. So the neatest thing about Quaru is he debuted in the Highlands, which is the original Monster Hunter map with dynamic weather. And having that dynamic weather system, Frontier built a couple of monsters around that whole mechanic. The most impressive of which is Quaru-Sepusu. So, when it's all bright and sunny and shiny, the crystals that adorn his hide can absorb a ton of sunlight and use that light and that heat as a way of attacking. So he can emit these massive bursting flashes of light to blind people who are attacking him, and he can focus fire that heat into massive beams of concentrated sunlight. There's even a particularly special quest for Quaru-Sepusu in Frontier where there'll be 2 of these guys out in the larger desert, and they'll be able to combine their heat abilities together to create this huge superheated dome of light that can basically incinerate anybody who's touching it. And the Windward Plains has maps that are large enough to allow 2 Quarus to do this if they wanted to include that interaction, which I think would be a great reference. And when it's all nice and stormy out, those crystals will instead absorb electricity. And he has some pretty similar abilities. He can fire off a huge electric discharge, and he can fire off a giant bolt of lightning from his horn. Kind of similar to Raidao, yeah, but again, there's some differences in how the 2 operate, for sure. The other cool thing is that these crystals can be shaken off of his body and filled up with the energy they've absorbed. It's almost kind of like he's ejecting some of this excess elemental energy to keep himself safe from his own power. You can destroy these crystals before they explode from being overwhelmed, and if you do so, you can charge up your own weapons with their elements. This is because Quaru is actually susceptible to the elements that he is currently powered by, which also makes Quaru particularly interesting for a game like Wilds that has the weapon swap system. There's not a lot of monsters in the game so far with shifting elemental weaknesses that are strong enough to really warrant using dual weapons. The only one's really Nursilla, and she does not have a lot of health in Wild so far. But Quaru is a much larger, much tankier, much higher difficulty monster, and his elemental weaknesses will shift throughout the fight according to the powers that he has on display. So this is a prime candidate for a game where you can swap your weapons around on the fly. And he's not just an elemental user either. He is a Leviathan that has its own kit of tools. He uses his spear-like nose a lot for attacking, for stabbing, for piercing, whereas Balahara is more of kind of like a lunger and a diver and a tail stabber. He also has this really sick attack where he'll just stab his head into the ground, use that as an access point and go swirling around it. I love that attack. Really, really fun fight. One of my all-time favorites from Frontier that isn't one of the super endgame monsters. He uses a lot of stuff that Ignactor and Lagiacrus has while still having his own techniques and his own tactics. The elemental shifting is great. I think this model would look exceptional exceptional in full HD. I think he just matches a lot of the mechanics that are in the game incredibly well. He is a very, very mechanically in-depth monster for when he was created. Super ahead of his time and a fantastic fight, which even though there are some similarities with the monsters that dwell in the Windward Plains, still makes him the monster that I want on this map the most. Next up for the Windward Plains, we have Akura Vashimu. This is a guy that Monster Hunter fans have wanted in mainline for a very long time. He's a sick concept, and he's also one of the Frontier OGs, back from really early in the game's life cycle. And Wilds is kind of lacking on its bug monsters. Yeah, we got the 2 spiders, but we don't have any of the more insectoidy insects. We don't have any of the crabs. We don't have a lot of the arthropods. A big desert scorpion would be kind of sick, honestly. So Akura Vashimu's got some interesting stuff to him. First off, he has the crystal status, which has never been in mainline, and it's a good thing because crystal status will probably need to be reworked for mainline, which we'll talk about in a second. And he's also got a very, very complicated part break, which I think they should maintain because of, again, the weapon swapping that's in Wilds. Without belaboring the point too much, basically, if you want to snap the crystals off of his arms and his head, that I think takes cutting damage. If you want to actually get the proper claw and head breaks, that takes impact damage. You got to do all of that, wait for a certain specification, get a particular knockdown, and you need to do all that if you want to get the tail cut, and he has the ability to reconstitute his crystals on his body if you're too slow to get the breaks on his claws and his head properly. So it is a very, very, very complicated tail cut, and his tail is incredibly powerful because that's how he deploys the crystal blights. And he's also a tremendous asshole who will eat his tail if you take too long to carve it. I don't know if you got to keep that part, but I think that's really funny. And again, with the weapon swapping, having a hammer in the back pocket and like a long sword on your main so you can hack off the crystals, swap off, then go for the body breaks, and swap back off to go for the tail cut could be particularly really fun to play around with. The Crystal Blight itself is just a lot. It does a number of things. It'll cut your stamina down to its absolute minimum. It'll wrap you up in a status that prevents you from running around or rolling or unsheathing your weapon, kind of like the old Snowman and Muddy status. And if it takes too long for you to get rid of it by shaking it off, you're gonna explode. It's a lot. It does a lot of stuff. I would probably recommend that they change it so that it will like gradually encase you, kind of like the Frostbite effect that Frontier has, where they'll have ice monsters that can gradually encase you in ice and lock you in place. And if you want to keep like the stamina full drain, I think that also makes sense, but I don't think you have to do the explosion part too. That doesn't even really make sense, but it would make sense for Akura's crystals because it's like a fluid that he spews at you to crystallize you. So it's like kind of gradually self-replicating and growing all over you until it encases you and it leads you up to a really, really big hit. He's also got just a lot of weird jittery attacks with a lot of wind up and kind of false starts to them and just some really weird timings where he'll delay attack and then just shoot out for it really, really lightning fast, which I think works pretty cool for something like focus mode and for some of the other monsters in general who have some delays and some holdbacks and then some really, really snappy animations. So I think Akura's combat would make a lot of sense for Wilds. Also, he's a monster that would work pretty much anywhere. You have the big wide open spaces, but you also have the more claustrophobic closed-in cave systems that a weird skittery ambush predator like an Akura Vashimu would work very well in. So you'll have him maybe submerged underground and you'll have something like a Chatacabra or a Gypceros wandering around in these areas thinking that they're safe from the larger predators out there, and then they get ambushed by Vashimu. I think he would work very well in those cavernous midsections that make up the Windward Plains. I think he would be a really top hunter in that area that usually just kind of houses the smaller, weaker guys who are hiding from the big boys like Raidao and Doshagama. Yeah, maybe a slight little twist to his status would be great, but his intricate part break would be awesome for the weapon system. He's a great model just in general, a scorpion monster in like a proper scorpion, even more so than Celtis Queen. That's a great idea. Looks fantastic. The black and the purple looks awesome. Would look excellent in HD, no doubt about it. Yeah, Vashimu, get him in there. Absolutely. And finally for the Windward Plains, I have Ori Batoras. Now, when Wilds was being marketed, I got very excited for the concept that it looked like we were going to these more open concept, more free-flowing, less battle zone constricted maps with these huge sweeping environments, and that didn't really happen necessarily. I kind of thought we were going to get more big spectacle fights, which is cool. It's just not what I expected that the game was going to be. But some of the larger areas in the Windward Plains do still absolutely exist. There's 2 giant ones. And Odibatoras would be pretty sick on them and give this game a spectacle fight that it really deserves. The only tricky thing about Odibatoras, and the reason why he's in 3rd place, is due to the fact that the massive dune section has some verticality that would make his model work particularly awkward. If they really wanted to put some effort in, they could have it so that his model will naturally clip through the dunes. You can actually physically see him like shifting through them and messing around with the dunes and crashing through them, and part of his body will be obscured by the sand and part of it won't, and have that kind of angle to it. That'd be tricky and difficult, but it would be kind of sick. There's the more flat, wide open savanna type of area where he would still totally fit, but it's a little less deserty desert. And the other thing is, Odibatoras in his original incarnation didn't zone shift at all. So if they just want to lock him to one big zone and have that battle be solely there, that's perfectly fine because that's his original incarnation. Odie's a monster with a lot of really cool stuff. That giant shell on his back is a huge sand cannon, basically. His body will intake the sand that he sits around in the desert, and he can compress that down into these giant projectiles and also these huge sand attacks. He's got a bunch of vents all over his body where he can expel it out of his tail, out of his limbs, out of these vents on his shell. He can like broadside you with sand projectiles. He can fire off smaller clumps of sand rocks out of his body. He can fire off these ginormous cannon shots. He's also strong enough to manipulate the ground around him, kicking up these giant pillars of dirt and mud and sand around him. He's got a lot of physical attacks. He's got a really great grab bag of abilities, which makes him a lot of fun to fight and very satisfying to learn. Again, if they wanted to go really crazy with him and incorporate some wild stuff in there, what they could do here is make it so that when he kicks up those big sand columns, you could have it so that the Sacred like hops up onto them and he can run across those pillars, use them for an ability to maybe jump up on top of his shell to get some carves or weaken up his cannons up on top or something crazy like that. Really have fun with the Sacred mechanic and incorporate them more properly into the battle. You can do something like that. Just a really awesome spectacle fight on one of the normal maps, I think would be really cool and show off just the size and scale of wilds properly. Also, Odibatoras is a natural predator of Akura Fashimu, so if you want to incorporate that in some way, really sick interaction to work with. All right, so we're gonna hit the caveats already. There's one more monster that I would really like to see in the Windward Plains, but because of Raidao, I don't think he would get in. This one is Guren Zaburu. He's a flying wyvern that was also designed for the Highlands, much like Kuaru, and he also has a lightning absorption gimmick. We already have a lightning absorbing flying wyvern in the Windward Plains, but Guren's a cool monster who does a lot of his own thing. Basically, the way he works is he can get paralyzed by the lightning, but if he ever gets paralyzed, he can kind of take that electricity into his body and expel it out as a gas, as a counterattack for those who are trying to kill him while he's being paralyzed, which is an interesting mechanic that nothing else really has. It's kind of like an aftershock after being afflicted by his status, which is really neat. He's a water-based flying wyvern. He has a lot of Plesioth-esque water beams and water projectiles. He's also just a full-on bruiser, very hyper-violent, kind of a berserker. Uses a lot of big full-body attacks and slams and whatnot. Again, very similar stuff to Raidao, and it might be kind of interesting to see a slightly more grounded but also lightning absorbing flying wyvern counter to Raidao, someone who could absorb the lightning bolts that he fires off and redistribute them in a different way as a defense mechanism. That would be interesting. The other really cool thing about Guren Zaburu is that in his ecology and his lore, he has a very compelling relationship with herbivores. Guren will only get aggressive towards perceived threats. Basically anything else he won't even bother with. So herbivores that will not threaten him any way whatsoever, he's perfectly fine with. And he is said in the Highlands lore to have a relationship with the large herbivores who live there as a bit of an unintentional shepherd and protector, where if other predators are trying to go at those herbivores, they're gonna get Guren pissed off and he'll fight them off. So a lot of larger herbivores will naturally move towards Guren, who is not a threat to them. And the Windward Plains is filled with a lot of very large herbivores, mainly the Ceratinoth and whatnot. Now, there's not a lot of very active predation going on in wilds, but it would be an interesting interaction to witness in the game. If anything gets close to the Ceratinoth hordes, then Guren will get particularly aggressive towards those monsters. Could be a really cool interaction. The game doesn't quite have that many heavy environment interactions in it at the moment, but I think it would work particularly well if they wanted to do it. So yeah, another really cool pick. I think Raidao kind of cancels them out. All right. Finally moving into the Scarlet Forest, I've got Photokururu as the #1 monster I want on this map. The way Photokururu works is that he will take in the pollens and the nectars from certain flowers and take on their properties into his feathers and into the fluids that his body produces and utilize their abilities. There's a couple of spots in the Scarlet Forest that have an absolute bounty of these different multicolored flowers that he could utilize. They don't necessarily in-game have any statuses attributed to them, but if you want to make it up, then you can make it up. That's perfectly fine. There are the flowers in the region to set the precedent that he can use these abilities. He's also one of the cooler, tougher bird wyverns in the entirety of Monster Hunter, and we haven't had a cool, tough bird wyvern in a very, very, very long time. This category is starving for powerhouses, and this would be a beautiful, perfect monster to incorporate, as I think the map works with him particularly well. I mean, back in Frontier, they went and basically made a map for his entire gimmick. So he only has one moveset, but he'll swap around between the different status effects sporadically throughout the hunt. And he's got a lot of different stuff he can do. He can use the fire element with some flowers. He can use poison, paralysis, sleep, blindness, soiled, all kinds of stuff. I think there's even more than that, honestly. And every single time he'll take in a pollen, what he'll do is the pollen will kind of go into his feathers and into his scales and into his tassels. They'll change up the colors of his body, and the pollen that gets kicked off and the globules of fluids that he'll emit from himself will have different effects tied to whatever kind of pollen that he took in. So he's got these spit up attacks. He's got this one move where he'll corkscrew up into the air and just kick up a whole bunch of these status fluids everywhere. He has these strafing runs. He's a pretty big, beefy monster that can do a lot of damage and has a lot of detrimental abilities, but he's also not super duper fast. He's very graceful, very, very fun to fight. You also have Arkveld, who has the whip tassels coming off of his limbs, so you have the technology already in wilds to work with a monster like this. He is basically the bird wyvern equivalent of stuff like Berukyros and Doragyros, who are the monsters who pioneered those whip appendages, so he has those as well. Very cool monster, beautiful, deserves to be in a big jungle environment. The bird wyverns need a monster of this power level. There's flowers in the environment to set the precedent for his abilities. I think he would look absolutely gorgeous, all high rendered in wilds. I think this is one that you really, really want to put in. I think in the full plenty of the Scarlet Forest, this might be one of the prettiest looking monsters in the entire game, and a really, really cool fight that would make use of the fact that wilds kind of pushes you towards using some comfy skills and some defensive skills because they're now locked onto armor. So you'd actually be encouraged to kind of counter build for him a little bit because it's a little bit more convenient for you to get some non-damage skills now. So to be able to defend yourself against some of this status work. Awesome monster. I think he deserves to be in the Scarlet Forest 100%. And next up for the forest, I have Abiorugu. Now here's an interesting one, because Wilds is kind of lacking a big dinosaur bruiser brute wyvern, minus Guardian Fulgur Anjanath, but he kind of gets some points deducted because he's really just kind of like a boss fight out in the ruins of Wyveria Thunderdome area where just monsters go and beat the crap out of each other. Out in the actual wilderness, we don't really have a very dinosaurian brute wyvern. We have Rompo and we have Caimatrice. So Abio would be a nice big dinosaurian predator to throw out into the woods. Fits the jungle environment perfectly and can compete with a lot of the other top level hunters out there. You also don't have a Deviljho or a Glavenus to really kind of clash with his niche in this game. And even if you did, Abio does have enough stuff to his own where he would still feel like a unique monster despite there being a Glavenus or a Deviljho in this game. He used to really just kind of be a Deviljho clone, but as he was developed as Frontier went on, he got a lot of his own stuff. He's got a lot of his own tail attacks, he's got defense down, he's got his own fire breath attacks, he's got these juggle combos where he can throw you up into the air and blow you up with a fireball, he's got this rollout attack where he can come crashing into you kind of like Uragan does, but it's way less time consuming and way less annoying. Also, Abiorugu can be a cooperative species, so there you have a pack mechanic where you might be able to fight a duo of these guys semi-regularly. The forest already does have a pack with the Eon Kutku, but having two substantially more dangerous dinosaurs come thrashing at you at full aggression could be a really cool encounter, honestly. Kind of like the Ajarikans, where they can pretty often team up, even if they're not always definitely going to be a pack. Abio is another one of my favorite fights. He's just a great brawler. It's nothing too ridiculous. He's just got a lot of cool moves. He's got stomps and tail stabs and tail sweeps and fireballs, charged fire explosions and air combo juggles and rollout attacks and biting attacks. He's just fun. He's great. He's well balanced. He distinguishes himself. He's got an excellent design. It's very simple but very effective. A good use of greens and reds would blend in with the jungle particularly well. I think that jungle needs a good big bad dinosaur running around in it. That's something the Scarlet Forest is definitely missing. And thirdly for the Scarlet Forest, I have Xena Serisu. So whereas Forokururu was a monster who had a map designed after it, that being the flower fields to work with his gimmick, Xena Serisu also kind of had a map made after him, that being the Painted Falls. This map that is completely covered in lakes and ponds and rivers from all these waterfalls flowing. Makes both of these monsters work really, really well for the Scarlet Forest, which is a flower-covered jungle that is absolutely flooded in water. Pretty matching, honestly. There's a couple of reasons Xena Serisu is third. I think it would work brilliantly, but we also have with Forokururu another whip tassel wyvern that we would have in this area. We don't have his progenitors in Berkyros or Doragyros on here, but he's his own species, so that still makes sense. And the other thing is that Xena would need to be scaled down, like a lot. Xena was added pretty late on in the game's lifespan. I think he's maybe the third or fourth last original monster designed for Monster Hunter Frontier. He's from around the Z era, which was about 10 years in, when things were just nuts. They had to be. And Xena Serisu is like nuts compared to what an animal like him should probably be. Some of the stuff this dude does is stupid. Some of the just sheer onslaught geysers of water that he can put out is crazy. What he can do, though, that makes sense, if it's scaled down in terms of size a little bit, is that the water that is emitted from his whip tassels is so high pressure, so sharp, so moving so fast, so dense, that it can split rock. So what he'll do sometimes is he'll kick up stones and boulders up from out of the air and then just slice them to bits and use those as projectiles. He'll also eject a lot of that high pressure from these vents in the whip tassels to do a lot of damage there. He'll kick up and manipulate the water in the area that is around, as well as also just cutting and slashing and slicing through the air. He's a really fun bastard asshole of a fight. And he's got this little just bitch slap wing whip thing that catches me off guard like all the time. He's a fun bastard is probably how I would best describe him. Looks great too. We have another bat monster in Paolumu, but this is an edgy bat monster. He's got the big ears, razor sharp fangs and scales, jet black coloration. He's got this really, really cool mix of reds and blues and whites with the black. Awesome looking color palettes. Just a bizarre freakazoid, wackadoodle, crazy psycho monster. The sheer scale of his abilities, yeah, you probably want to dial that back down because he was designed in an area where he had to be that big, and the actual creature itself probably shouldn't be able to do the things that he does, but the ideas are there with the water manipulation and the water slicing and the rock crushing and slashing and the projectiles off of that. The really high pressure water cover whip wing wyvern. Try saying that a couple of times fast. Holy crap. Super duper cool guy. Bumps into a couple other things and would need a bit of a scale down in terms of attack size, but I think Xena would work very, very well for a watery jungle map like this. And an extra quick little caveat for this one. I want Espinas on this map. If we're talking frontier monsters, you kind of have to talk about the main frontier monster. He's already in mainline. He was in Sunbreak. He was excellent in Sunbreak. Everybody really liked him. Scored really high on a whole bunch of polls and whatnot. Espinas is great. Awesome monster, would fit really well, and with a more kind of grounded, boots on the ground game without the wire bug setups and everything, I think you can fit in Espinas's personality a lot better with the fact that he just kind of sleeps and dopes around and is very kind of meandering and slow and whatnot, and then goes explosive. What you would probably want to do it is that his armor is so super duper tough that when he's in his more armored, unenraged state, you can't open up wounds on his body. I think you would probably need to do that just to prevent him from getting obliterated right in the opening bouts of the game, which would make sense for his lore because his body will kind of soften up as he gets angry and then he'll explode and get really, really snappy. He's got a lot of cool combos and a lot of redirection and some ability to kind of like turn on a dime and come at you with multi-charges that would work really cool with focus mode. He's got multi-statuses. We need more dangerous monsters in this game. He would look great. He is awesome. Very, very cool fight. Great monster. And if we're talking about frontier stuff, we got to talk about him. So yeah, he's not in the top 3 because he's already been in mainline. If we're talking frontier monsters, you got to show respect to the OG guy. Okay, now this is where things start to kind of get a little challenging. The Oil Well Basin and the Ice Shard Cliffs and the ruins of Wyveria are specific. There's not a lot of stuff out there quite like him. So I kind of got to challenge myself to pick some really good contenders to be in here. And I think I got some good ones. So number one for me in the Oil Well Basin, kind of to my surprise, is Pariapuria, a monster that in Frontier I'm not overly fond of. Honestly, in terms of the original creations of that game, I think he's underwhelming, but he's a concept that I think has some potential to him. He's a pretty interesting one. He's a bit of a gross out weirdo, can just kind of eat anything monster. You know, if you can get him to regurgitate his meal, you'll find like anything in the contents of his stomach. Different ores and materials and all this kind of weird gunk and different bits of monsters and whatnot. The dude eats anything, which I think would work cool for this toxic, sludgy, cavernous, gross, rank area where you have a whole bunch of monsters and you just have this gnarly, disgusting, big, chunky predator up there, up in the swampy tar regions that's just kind of killing and eating whatever it wants. There's some bigger regions up there too, so you can kind of chunk up Pariapuri a little bit too. He's supposed to be a big, beefy bruiser, kind of slow and chunky to him. There's also the tinged meat mechanic that he has where he'll drool a certain color, so you can force feed him these different status raw meats to try and get him over encumbered and knock him down. It's a neat little gimmick that you're usually not going to use because it takes more time than it's actually worth, but it's there, and it's a way to get rare drops out of him as well. I think he fits. I think the way he works in Frontier is that he's a resident of the Gorge, which is more of like a canyon map. But he himself doesn't really go out into the open air. He just kind of trudges around in the caverns and in the dark and in the rank down there. And the Oil Well Basin is a very dark and cavernous and rank and dank map. So I think in that vein, he makes sense just to be this gross weirdo who's in there just trying to eat everything. He's menacing the small monsters and the Rompopolo. He'll even try to like grab at a Rathian if he could. He'd probably be a legitimate threat to a Jarakan just because he's so big and beefy and just belligerently tries to eat everything. There is no soul in those eyes. He's got a one-track mind to just eat, to the detriment of himself, which makes him kind of interesting. But yeah, thematically, and I think just as a weird out, gross monster, I think Paria works particularly well. He's also another stench user, which we only have the one of, and if we're gonna have a status in the game, I feel like we should probably have a couple of monsters on the roster who uses it, otherwise it feels a little weird to have it. So having another stench monster for the sake of having another stench monster is a good idea. He would definitely need a bit of a move kit flesh out. He's very simple. He's really just kind of slow Tigrex with a couple of his own things. You can figure it out. You can make him perfectly interesting. He's also, like I said, a big slow Tigrex, and we don't have any pseudo Wyverns in Wilds at the moment. So to flush out that missing gap with a Frontier original who isn't one of the big, sleek, graceful, big cat animals, but is instead this giant, fugly, axolotl, fox, fish, weirdo thing, I think that would be kind of sick. So yeah, much to my surprise, I think Pariapuri would be a really cool addition to the Oil Well Basin. So the second entry for the Oil Well Basin is kind of gonna be a spoiler for one of the entries for the Ice Shard Cliffs, but that's just how the video pans out because that's how the maps pan out. Midogaron is a more powerful version of a monster called Kamu Orugaron that lost its mate in combat some time ago. So this Kamu Orugaron has trained himself and worked himself and fought and battled to be perfect, to the point where he can support himself completely on his own. And he has become so fast, so powerful, so brutal, so berserker lightning quick that he can move so fast that it seems like he's teleporting. It's very much kind of like Malzeno, where he's not actually teleporting, but he moves so quickly that if you blink, you're gonna miss him. I kind of like stuff like that, and we do have main series precedent for stuff like that, so it's not outside the realm of powers that we have in Monster Hunter. Beat for beat, blow for blow, Kamu is one of my favorite fights that Frontier has to offer. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of top 5. He is ridiculously fun, especially as a solo hunt, honestly. And I think he would work very, very well for focus mode due to the fact that he's so fast, has so much reposition ability. We'll try to get behind you, we'll try to fake you out, we'll try to duck you out, and what you really got to do is you got to use that camera rotation and hold down the line and wait for him to use his really big attacks to try and get the opportunities to hit him back. Because as brutal and as fast and as berserk as he is, he'll wear himself down, which is a really interesting thing about him, is that he has a kind of sense of exhaustion to him that is even more so than other monsters who can tire himself out. He's very spastic. He'll put everything into killing you at the instant that he's fighting, to the point where he'll break himself down faster than most other monsters will. But good lord, is it a tough fight to try and survive. He's got warping claw strikes, warping fireballs. He'll try to do these kind of fake out dashes to try and make you think that he's targeting one hunter when he'll actually be going after another, try to psych that guy out and get a free hit on you. He's got deployable spikes he can launch out of himself. He has the ability to lunge up into the air at particularly high distances and fire off fireballs down from that elevation. He's just got a ton of ability to move, and I think that's gonna be perfect for something like Wilds, which wants its monsters to be fast and have a lot of movement and have a lot of kinetic energy because of the way that focus mode works. So I think he would be a naturally excellent pair, and they'd be able to push his speed incredibly far, and I think we'd be seeing a monster that can really kind of push the limits of the speed and the ability and the capacity that the hunters of Wilds have that we don't quite have just yet. And as the expansions and the Master Rank stuff for these more modern Monster Hunter games tend to do. So I think Midogron is going to be an excellent counterpart for the hunters of Wilds. And just, he's already a fantastic battle. You really don't have to change that much to make this just one of the most fun duels that the game would have to offer. So this last one for the Oil Well Basin is kind of tricky. I think there's 3 good candidates, but they all have their own issues. I mulled it over a lot, and I think the third one for the list is definitely going to be Varusaburos, who is the burst species of Diablos. Basically, he's a Balrog dragon. This dude is sick. There's 2 issues with Varusaburos that I think can be circumnavigated. The first one is that he is a Diablos and he needs some room to run. And there are spaces within the Oil Well Basin that give him that room to run. There are also some smaller areas too. Not like he can't scene change between a couple of zones at once to go between the couple of really big ones, but he's a Bloss and does need to run around. Though, to be fair, the more modern Blosses have been able to work fairly well in slightly more contained areas, as they're a little bit more combo oriented rather than just dig and charge spammers like they used to be in the classic games. And having very recently refought Varusaburos, he's not super movement dependent. He's a little bit more combo heavy and singular attack focused than I even remembered. He doesn't spam his charges and his dig attacks a ton. The most movement that he needs is twofold. He needs to be able to fly, which the Oil Well Basin has the height in its caverns to allow him to do, and he has one attack where he can kind of run in a triangle formation to try and box you in and blow up that area. There's a couple of regions that are definitely going to be too small for that attack, but there are a few where he'll definitely have the room to run, and in some of the more medium level encounters, that attack is going to be terrifying because it's going to take up like a lot of the map, and you really got to be careful to get out of it, so that could be kind of fun. The other problem is that he kind of has a keep away feature. It's a very unique feature that only he has. Basically, there is a special cacti where he lives that can grant him these unique abilities to heighten his flames. And if he grabs it and he nabs it, he'll dig underground, he'll eat it, and it'll explode back out in a big burst of fire, and his fight will ramp up and he'll gain new attacks. If he doesn't get that cactus, he'll burn himself out, he'll become extremely sluggish, and he'll basically just be a second generation Diablos, but even slower. So that cacti obviously doesn't exist in Wilds at the moment, and it's really just this distinct object that just materializes in the middle of the map that you fight him on. So you can do one of 2 things. You could take this mechanic out and just have him fight normally. To be fair, the vast majority of people who are actually going to fight Varusaburos are going to just go for the normal battle. The normal battle is completely doable. It is far from the craziest thing in the game. It's a lot of fun. It's a really good fight, and they're just going to completely ignore that gimmick, which is fine. And if Wilds wants to toss out that gimmick, there's really not going to be a ton of stuff lost, barring just the sheer unique novelty of the mechanic itself. I think people are just going to want to normally fight Varusaburos because his fight is exceptionally fun at max power. The other thing you could do is kind of what they do with Jin Dahad. Because Jin Dahad doesn't work on the traditional Ice Shard cliffs, he has his own quest that will materialize, and then you can select that quest to automatically proc it and start going, and you'll develop into that separate instance where Jin Dahad is. is, you might not necessarily need an extra map, but you might get a special prompt when Varu shows up. It's like you can initiate a Varu Sabaros quest, and it will trigger a different instance where the special cacti will then be spawned for him to consume. I think either of those options are perfectly fine. If you want to keep the uniqueness of his gimmick, then sure, go ahead, go for it. I think most people are just going to want to normally fight him because he's crazy and fun. He's another monster that has a lot of repositioning and a lot of getting behind you and a lot of trying to like box you out and fake you out, and has just a lot of weird hip checks and head slams, and is really just trying to get around you and get behind your guard, kind of like what Midogaron does. I think he's another fight that would be really, really fun for focus mode, and a lot of his attacks don't need him to be running all over the place. He's got a lot of big, heavy head slams and tail explosions, fire columns and bursts like that. Very physical with a lot of fire edge to him. He's another one where I think the model would look exceptional in high definition. As is, he's got these little fire jets that come popping out of him, and they really just kind of look like little neon lights poofing out of his body. But dude, in like full render with modern particle effects and whatnot, you see like those jets of fire coming out of his tail and out of his horns and out of his back vents and whatnot. Dude, it'd be a demon Diablos out in the oil well basin just running over people. That'd be sick as hell, dude. The only other weird thing about it, I guess, and this is super minor, is that there aren't any Blosses in Wilds at the moment. Who knows? Maybe we'll get them in expansion. It was good enough for Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, so it's good enough for Wilds. We can get a Diablos in the Master Rank. Why not? And also, we're kind of at a point where they're willing to add stuff even without having the base species in there. So if they just wanted to do Varu and there's no normal Diablos, that could work too, honestly. But yeah, I think this one would be a ton of fun. I think you just got to be a little bit careful with some of the maps. Some of them are a little small, and he's going to have to be kind of choosy with where he actually goes to fight. And they're going to want to figure out exactly what they want to do about his keep away gimmick. But the actual core fight, how it interacts with focus, how he's going to look, how just flat out cool he'd be in the oil well basin, how great of a fight he is in Frontier, I think Varu would be an excellent candidate, but he is at the bottom of this list. And I'm going to briefly talk about the other two candidates that I think would work in the oil well basin, maybe even a little bit better. The biggest issue is I think they have monsters that really heavily compromise the need to have these two. I'm talking about Gasura Bazura and Vol'jang. Now, Gasura is typically a desert monster, honestly, and it might be a little weird to see him in the basin, but he's another one kind of like Pario, where he's a bit of just like a big weirdo, which I think would work well in an oil kind of swamp map like the oil well basin. I think you could do some cool stuff with him. He's a poison brute wyvern who does a lot of kind of poison gas manipulation and ground manipulation, which is what Rompo Polo does. Granted, it is on a much larger scale than Rompo and a much cooler fight, but yeah, Gasura clashes pretty heavily with how Rompo works and belongs to a different environment, typically. But you could have stuff with big poison explosions and oil toxic bombs and big kind of columns and ground manipulation that the enraged Gasura can do. Be pretty cool. I think he would still probably work very well, but outside his typical environment, any kind of clashes. The other thing that clashes is Vol'jang against Ajarakan, whereas Vol'jang is an ancient species of Rajang, who is this rocky fire monkey with fire punches and fire abilities, and Ajarakan is a rocky-looking fire monkey with fire punches and fire abilities. So again, those two clash pretty hard, and of the two, Vol'jang is a much higher level monster that, again, kind of like Varu, needs a good amount of space. Less space, but I think you'd really just be looking at a superpowered Ajarakan. I think they clash pretty damn heavily in what exactly they do. Vol'jang would still be pretty cool, though. All right, so now we're going to move on into the Ice Shard Cliffs. Now, there are plenty of ice monsters in Frontier. The issue being, most of them were developed for the Polar Sea in mind, and not for a very kind of small, narrow, suspended over the air, ice-covered fortress map like the cliffs are. Very, very different in terms of the specificities of their ice biome. So we have a lot of monsters from Frontier that are really just kind of not gonna work for this map. But I do think we do have some good contenders here. First up is going to be a pairing, Kamu and Nono Orugaron. Now, off of Midogaron being brought up a little earlier, you could tell that these two were coming along. You kind of need these guys if you want Midogaron, as Midogaron is basically a Kamu that went through a whole metamorphosis. So these two would fit very well into the pack mechanics of Wilds because they are a duo. They are one of the first, probably the first monsters in Monster Hunter that were programmed and built around being a combination of monsters. There's a couple of other monsters in Frontier that expand on this gimmick a lot more, and there's some stuff with Teostra and Lunastra in mainline that goes into this, but Kamu and Nono were the first. And with a modern rendition, they could probably be made into an even better pairing than they are in Frontier. As in Frontier, they're not super cohesive. Really, it's two wolves with different models that have effectively the same kits and a couple of behaviors that they use together. They are a particularly interesting skeleton, not quite like Odogaron and Lunagaron, built somewhat differently, kind of having still the more monkeyish posture of like the Kongas and the Blangos, but much sleeker. They are pretty erratic and very vicious in their physical attackings, with a lot of big bites and hops and pounces, some very odd and unconventional angles of attack to them. Their movesets don't have a ton of cohesiveness. They have the abilities to launch their razor-sharp projectiles off of their body like Dogaron can. In their G-rank form in Frontier, they have the ability to encase their paws in ice and add a frosty effect to many of their attacks in that regard, and they each have roars that are capable of dealing damage and knocking you down. They have incredibly powerful howls. They have a little bit of synergy with each other, in which if one of them dies, the other will stop to mourn the passing of their mate and go into a permanent enraged berserker state. I think you could even bump up their cohesiveness a little bit more, make them very intelligent, make them stay out of their own way, but also kind of like attack hunters that are going after their mates, kind of helping to perhaps clear off a distressed mate from attackers while the other one watches the other's back. Give them like some ability to maybe kind of protect one another, as the biggest part of their personality is that they have a particularly strong bond and attachment to one another. So you can have them coded in a way that they deliberately try to go after hunters who are doing a lot of damage to the other Orugaron, and make it so that you really kind of can't turn your back on either. Makes multiplayer divvying up a little bit more interesting, as well as the Orugarons are going to be bouncing back and forth between hunters and making things just really erratic and fast-paced. I think that could be kind of cool, and I think it would blend into their personalities extremely well. These are two fairly simple monsters in terms of their mechanics, but everything that they do in all of their animations are fairly unique just to them, so they'll be a bit of a breath of fresh air. And with their small sizes, I think they're going to be able to fit into the Ice Shard Cliffs very, very well. They're very athletic, they're very fast, they're particularly small and lean for large monsters, so they'll be able to maneuver around the corridors and passageways and leap between the suspended rocks very, very well. Another very heavy movement-based pairing that I think would do some really good work being made into even more prominent ice monsters than they already are, and will kind of flesh out the pack mechanics, giving these two some desire to actually preserve the other's life rather than just being a mosh pit of monsters that are all fighting together. I think you can really kind of factor in the relationship between these two animals extremely well if you wanted to go fully in that direction. And secondly, for the Ice Shard Cliffs, I have Zeru Ryusu, that being the burst species of Rathalos. The burst species is effectively a very close relation of another animal, but not quite exactly the same species. And you can note that Zeru Ryusu isn't quite a wrath from the tail shape and the wing patterns and the scale structure and the crystalline formations on his body and the slightly different head shape and the slightly different soundscape and all that kind of stuff. So with the Ice Shard Cliffs being a very open air, very vertical area that's kind of narrow little passageways with fairly decently wide enough zones, it's curious that we don't really have a lot of dedicated flyers on the map, barring pretty much just Arkveld. So I feel like someone who's flying around a lot is gonna benefit from this map being structured the way that it is. There's a few different contenders, but I'm going with Zeru Ryusu over a few of them for a few reasons. One of them being is that Doragyros, who I would have picked, is the subspecies or close relation of Berukyros, who I don't have on this list, and wouldn't get into this game probably due to the fact that Raidao exists. So Zeru Ryusu is a very majestic, very ancestral, very ancient feeling Rathalos. The way that he works in terms of lore is that he is very, very, very infrequently spotted and only up at the tops of towers. It's a very kind of religious, majestic, legendary, mythical encounter if you ever came across one in lore, you know, not from a game standpoint. Aesthetically, I think the Ice Shard Cliffs, as it is this gothic, frozen over, brass, ancient cathedral looking place would kind of be something that Zero would work on. And then color scheme wise, I think he blends very well with an ice map because of the white scales and the blue crystals. So I think he would look very aesthetically pleasing on here. We have another monster who would work fantastically for the weapon changing gimmick, as the core concept of Zero is that when he goes into his second phase, he has the ability to shift his body and the crystal structures all over himself to counter the properties of certain weapons. So he has a range counter state, he has a blade master counter state, and he has an impact counter state. So if you're running impact weapons, he'll harden over the tusk-like crystals over his face, make them into two much larger protrusions. His head will take significantly less damage, and he'll attack much more straightforwardly to try and get at hammer wielders and hunting horn wielders. If you're attacking with blades and trying to go for the trip-ups on his legs, he hardens up the crystal on his legs and goes for a lot of kicks and slashes with those attacks. And if you're playing gunner, he'll overdevelop the crystals on his tail and fire off more range projectiles to try and zone you out as you're trying to zone him out. And again, with the weapon swapping that we have in this game, it could be really cool to forcibly try to shift him over to different modes and force him into these different states to kind of establish yourself in a certain way that you can swap back over to another weapon and have a counter pick against the build that he just ran. So you have like a light bowgun on one pocket, you start firing that off, get him into the anti-range mode, then you swap back over to a hammer, you close that distance as he's trying to zone you out, and you crack him over the skull, and you just go back and forth and back and forth. Again, give us another reason to use those weapon changes that, as of right now, don't really have a lot of reason to be in the game. And then, despite the Ice Shard Cliffs being probably the most claustrophobic, the fact that he can fly around means that he can get to those couple of open air zones where he will have the room to move around. And he has a lot of just like flying up and out of the reach of the zone, come crashing back down. He's got some retreating shots with his tail lasers and stuff like that. He's got some spinning attacks. He's got a couple of charges, but again, this is one that doesn't need a ton of ground movement to work with. He needs altitude, and altitude the Ice Shard Cliffs will give him as it's built up on top of a mountain. There's a couple of the regions up at the very top of the map where I think he'll stick to pretty consistently, and that's perfectly fine. He'll be able to fly around and get to a couple of zones back and forth and should work just fine. He is a fight that I really like. He's got a very kind of lofty feel to him, very graceful, kind of slow paced, but not like deliberately dragged out, just very majestic. He's got this really cool atmospheric battle track that is non-melodic, but it works for him, and it really kind of sells the atmosphere of him. And just, yeah, having this kind of godly Rathalos descend from the heavens over this icy, ancient, frozen over, brass goth cathedral, I think would be an immaculate visual for this game. And thirdly, what I have for the Ice Shard Cliffs is Duragawa. This is another Frontier original pseudo-wyvern. This one, unlike Pariapuria, is much more kind of scrawny and scrappy and narrow. Built more for the Ice Shard Cliffs, very small, claustrophobic environments. I think you could have a kind of Barioth situation where he's leaping up onto walls and off of walls and jumping off of them and stuff like that. Kind of takes some inspiration from that monster, but with his own gimmicks and twists and whatnot to how things operate. The only reason Duragawa is third, as I think he would probably work a little bit better in terms of map accommodation than Zero Ryusu, is that Duragawa doesn't typically actually live in ice regions. Now, the Ice Shard Cliffs has bonkers enough monster placement as it is already, but typically, Duragawa is actually going to hide out in more arid environments. He hangs out in the Gorge, which is a more kind of canyon map typically, but he can also be found hanging out on the Tower, which is where you're first going to encounter him in Frontier. If you want to make that bypass, then you can make that bypass. I think Dura would fit on the map pretty well. He's a good ice monster, and again, we don't have any flying wyverns minus Arkveld on the Ice Shard Cliffs. So again, he's going to make for a pretty well-sized monster for this map, and though he is an ice pseudo-wyvern like Barioth, Barioth isn't in the game to take up that niche. And the other thing is, he does a lot of his own stuff. So instead of breathing up these large ice blast attacks like Barioth does, what Duragawa can do is he can frost over much of his body. Another one of the ice armor gimmick monsters. We have a lot of those for sure, but he does it slightly differently, only partially encasing himself. And what he can do is he'll slash and hack with his claws to kind of kick up these very powerful gale force winds of ice to go flying at opponents. So it's more of a moving projectile tornado than the stationary blast that Barioth shows off. He's also got a very unique debuff to him where he'll basically reset you to a cold status where you need a hot drink. So he has very specific special ice attacks where he can put you in the increased stamina depletion state that you would normally need in a cold environment. So he can have an ability where he can basically delete your hot drink, which isn't super duper deadly, but it is an interesting mechanic that he would have. And he also has sleep on him, so that would be a way to bring in more sleep weapons into the game, barring just Nursilla, to kind of branch out that path and give sleep a couple more options as well. Okay, now the weird one. The Ruins of Wyveria is an odd map. It's the Thunderdome where the monsters go and beat the crap out of each other, and the Guardians are there as well. Now, what we're not going to do, because that would be lame and stupid, is we're not going to retcon any frontier monsters into being Guardians. Not doing that. I think that is disrespectful. I think that is a bad way to reintroduce those monsters. I've seen that idea floated around a couple of times. No, please just don't do that. I would hate for, oh, this thing that you remember from this beloved game from forever ago? Yeah, no, turns out he was a cyborg mutant monster all the time. No, we're not doing that. So I want to try and think of monsters that I think would actually be interesting within the artificial environment that the Ruins of Wyveria possesses, how they would operate within it. I need animals that could actually get in there and try to actually see how they would function and work within this map. So this one's gonna be really weird, and it's really gonna be a couple of shots in the dark here, but I'm gonna try my best. The first one that I have up on the list is Miru. Miru is a relative of Duragawa, another pseudo-wyvern. It's kind of why I wanted Duragawa in here, is to set some precedent for Miru showing up. Now, Miru would also be a crystal monster like a Kuravashimu if things were to work out that way, so it would be neat to have more than one monster that uses this status. Again, should be toned down, like I said with Akura, because crystal is kinda nuts. I was kind of thinking that having a crystalline monster like Miru might be interesting to have down in the Ruins of Wyveria because of the wyvern milk deposits and all that, and maybe kind of talk about how there's some relation to it. Like, for most of the Guardians, it's mostly just a fuel source, but what if you had a monster where it's actually able to garner some nutrition from the elemental powers of this? Not that I would want to retcon it that Miru gets its powers from the elemental absorption of the Wilk, but instead that it's something else that it can feed on. It has some properties that Miru is after that can enhance its own abilities and can kind of grow out these crystal powers. Maybe that's why you fight him in the narrative, is that the combination of his own biology with these properties of the wyvern milk is making one particular Miru who's down in the Ruins of Wyveria incredibly powerful, or something along those lines. Miru is pretty fascinating. He is a full-on shapeshifter who has the abilities of multiple other pseudo-wyverns, including his own. He's less so like Zero Ryusu in that he has hard counters to different states, but again, a shapeshifter like this might mean that you like one layout of weaponry against one of his forms more than another, so it's another excuse to bring in multiple different weapons to fight him. So he will, throughout the fight, shift through a numerous mismatch of states. He's got a base form that'll drop pretty quickly. He's got a speed form, which takes a lot from Nargacuga. He's got a power form that takes a lot from Tigrex. He's got a crystal form, which focuses mostly on crystal attacks. He's got an elemental form, which focuses mainly on fire attacks. You might want to do something where you have a little bit of blend between the crystal and the fire state so that his huge bursts of fire can interact with any Wilk deposits if you want to incorporate that into his moveset whatsoever. And then he has an ultra form, which is a mismatch of all of his states put together that basically takes his entire move pool and throws it at you simultaneously. The more Tigrex and Narga states as well also have their own list of moves that aren't just rips from other pseudo-wyverns, but it would be a cool way to get it so that you could have those classic monsters have some representation if they never get into wilds, period. Miru is just really cool. I think he matches the kind of vibe of the Ruins of Wyveria pretty well. Super mysterious, ultra unknowable, weird set of powers, shows up in the tower. Just a crazy oddity of an animal that I think would kind of match the visual aesthetic and could perhaps have some interesting implementation with the whatnots and the goings-on of this location. Also, he's just kind of a crazy good fight that can constantly throw different grab bags of moves at you. I like Miru a lot, honestly. Fighting him back to do footage for this video was pretty fun, honestly, even with the Crystal Blight being really annoying. So next up on the list for the Ruins of Wyveria, I actually have Miraganasu, who is the burst species of Espinas. Miraganas is not a monster that super interested me, and he's got probably one of the wackiest, most out there designs that Frontier has to offer. May have to be a little bit of proportion fixing here and there to kind of smooth things out going on, but Mira's got some untapped potential that I talked about when I actually did that second Frontier video that I think the Ruins of Wyveria might be able to provide. So Miraganas is a cavern-dwelling monster. He is effectively blind and operates entirely on hearing. So with the Ruins of Wyveria, you have a deep, dark down kind of cavernous biome, and there is light down there, but I think you could kind of put Mira more in the lower regions, and I think the way he would operate for the most part would be kind of burrowing into and out of zones and whatnot. One thing I think he should be able to do is he's got a big drill nose, and he's got like these jet engine pores coming out of his tail and the back of his wings and whatnot, and I've always kind of figured that Miraganas was supposed to be a monster who could dig extremely well. He's basically built like a jet drill, but he doesn't really have anything in his kit in Frontier that does anything like that. I think it would be super interesting if you had him kind of burrowing in and out of the walls along the sides of the Ruins of Wyveria, kind of like what Diablos can do in its own nest in World, where it's kind of tunneling in and out of those sand waterfalls, so it comes kind of burrowing and boring in through one wall and then comes crashing and shooting out of another one, or comes up out of the floor or something like that, can attack from different angles. You know, depending on what zone you're in, he can go into a wall and out of the floor, into the floor and out of some just crazy crap like that to kind of let him just move around a whole bunch and kind of play with that spastic Espinas hyper-aggression, while also being able to make use of the fact that he is a cavern-dwelling monster who can just propel himself at high speeds through walls. One interesting thing that I'm not entirely sure what they would do with is his elements. It's kind of the same thing with Zeru, is that Mira has something called the Dark Element. It is a mixture of ice and dragon. So whether or not they would introduce combo elements in Wilds proper, I have no idea. That sounds like it might be a little busted maybe, but they could swap it so that maybe he just has dragon or ice on his weapons individually, and maybe his actual attacks do both elements. That's kind of up to their discretion, but I don't think I'd see them bringing in combo elements on weapons quite like that. At the very least, I think like his dual blade should have dragon and ice on him. I think that'd be kind of cool. Yeah, Mira's a monster I don't particularly adore in Frontier, but that's because I don't think he fully does what I think he should do, and having a very kind of claustrophobic environment with still having plenty of room for him to run around, and zones that are going to be large enough where he can still have his movement but also turn on a dime really quickly, kind of like Espinas's opt to do, very kind of tight turns and everything, I think could work pretty well. I think this map would kind of give you an interesting opportunity to reinvent what I think is one of the more lackluster entries on Frontier's roster, so I'd kind of like to see it. And lastly, for the Ruins of Wyveria, I have Tycoon Zamuza. Tycoon kinda works. It's the big golem crab at the bottom of a cave. That's where you fight him in Frontiers. You'll fight him in the bottom of a cavern on an island. It'd be a little weird though. The way that Tycoon works is that he submerges himself under dirt and rock and fungus and crud and just amalgamates this kind of golem armor on top of his more orangey, typical crustacean-y crab shell. So his initial phase of the fight is a giant hulking behemoth of a Tycoon, and there really kind of isn't that much stuff to work with unless they wanted to change how the golem form feels and kind of have it so that it has a lot of the baked in kind of glowy luminescent vegetation that is a part of the Ruins of Wyveria in that kind of more gardeny area. They want to kind of have like the wyvern milk kind of like creasing lines across his shell or something like that. Again, not fully making him a guardian, but it's like inbuilt into him because he's dug under there, kind of like intaking, and you could kind of change him around in that way. I don't know. I kind of just needed a third entry, and and he's a monster that delves in deep, dark caves and whatnot. The other interesting thing about Tychon that I don't think they could do, because he really needs his own map to function properly in Frontier, is he has this kind of multi-layered system to his fight where if you knock a bunch of stuff off of his armor, he'll get upset, he'll bring down the floor of the map and kind of crash that down to another level, and he'll go into his more typical crustacean phase with a little faster. And if you can get all of the breaks on him and knock all the armor off of him and everything, he'll kind of break down the floor again, go to this kind of hidden bottom chamber at the very, very bottom of the cavern, and he'll go into this more alien-like ghost electric crab form that he has. And the ruins of Wyveria as is aren't necessarily built for that. If you want to do kind of a custom encounter for Tychon like you did for Jin Dahad, that would be something. I think kind of the general idea of the map works for it, but otherwise you'd probably just have a giant golem crab running around in the more gardeny areas. This is one where I needed an entry for number 3, and there was a bunch of like big bosses that could have potentially worked, but didn't have enough space down there. So Tychon could work, but this is a weird map, man. You'd probably want to put him somewhere else. But yeah, I could at least see it, right? And I'll cap this off saying that there's a few big bosses that I kind of want in Wilds just to have him in Wilds. The two big ones being Shantian and Guanzorumu. Guanzorumu just because he's one of my all-time, probably in like the top 5 monsters I've ever fought, ever, forever. He's phenomenal, and you can put him in anything and I'll be completely fine with it. And then Shantian I think would probably actually be kind of cool because of the crazy weather effects and whatnot that is the main kind of selling point of Wilds, that the fact that these biomes are kind of all over the place and crazy and whatnot, and to have a new big bad storm serpent dragon that's kind of taking advantage of these storms and inclemencies that are roaming through and kind of making everything go crazy, that could be kind of neat. You could have it so that you have this storm calling dragon who can kind of usurp the crazy biomes that the dragon torch and the ancient civilization created. Yeah, I think you could do something kind of neat with the weathery effects with Shantian, and I think it would be pretty fitting for how this game runs and operates. Could be a cool idea. And yeah, so that's gonna be 15, kind of give or take, Frontier monsters that I would want to see in Monster Hunter Wilds. The biggest issue with some of these guys is definitely a spacing thing. A lot of these guys are built to be kind of running around, have a lot of movement to them in some places, some more than others. I think still plenty of these would fit. Wilds has a couple of maps with zones that are large enough, but only kind of just so many. I think they would probably need to alter up a couple of these fights to tone down the scale of a couple of the attacks, to tone down the movement requirements of some of these attacks, but that's something that 5th generation Monster Hunter has been doing for a while, where they'll have monsters kind of charge all the way from one end of the environment to another way less. They'll have them kind of cut when they bypass hunters at one point and stop and go into another attack. So I think that that's going to be much less of a problem than it would have been for the kind of classical versions of the monsters. I'm sure they'd be rebalanced pretty well, but some of these monsters have a lot of stuff that would work really well with environment gimmicks, have stuff that would work really well with the weapon swapping gimmick, have stuff that would work with the kind of specifics of the maps that already exist in the game, have some interesting interactions with monsters that are already in the game. I think there's a lot of good picks for Frontier monsters that would work with what is provided in Wilds already. Some changes would need to be made, of course, but that's a given. Some rebalancing to kind of properly attune for how these things work. And a lot of these guys also have boxing out, outmaneuver type of kind of get around and behind you weird maneuvers that I think would be really, really cool for focus mode. I think replaying some of these fights, having Wilds as context, I think some of these fights are legitimately ahead of their time for how creative and crafty and intelligent and cunning they are, and bringing them into Wilds I think would create some incredible battles, as there is a ton of excellent groundwork built into some of these already existing kits, and I'd love to see at least a couple of these guys get in eventually. So this has been CR-Volcanic or Connor. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Shout out to all the patrons, and special shout out to Stromlin, Skyryu, Sir Newt Newt, Shaggy Grizzly, Sam Richley, Psychotic Jester, P-Berry, Nihilist Kymrax, Ketz, Datboy Doing Da Ding, Certified Rajang Hater, Sir SS Jacob, Pecco Plush, I Think I Stole Your Sandwich, and Call Sign Shadow. Thank you very much, everyone.